OPB Podcasts.
Live from the Gert Boyle studio, it's OPB Politics Now for Thursday, July 3rd. Oregon's legislative session ended less than a week ago, and how it ended still feels a bit surreal. Democrats entered the session with a supermajority and big plans to pass the transportation package and other major items, but that signature bill imploded. Lawmakers left the session with their tails between their legs, blaming each other for the mess. In Oregon, we're used to Republicans gumming up the works in the legislature, stalling bills, walking out, hiding in Idaho. But this year, the breakdown was led by Democrats. So as the dust settles, where does this leave state politics? Are the Dems in as much disarray as it appears? Have Oregon Republicans found a way to wield influence as a minority? Or is this just a repeat of past false starts in the run-up to a more successful effort to fund transportation down the line? We're getting into it all today. Welcome to the podcast. I'm OPB Politics reporter Alex Zielinski.
I'm OPB Politics reporter Bryce Dole.
And I'm OPB Politics reporter Dirk VanderHart.
First off, thank you for your service in the wee hours of Friday last week at the Capitol.
Yeah.
As someone who has also stayed up way too late following spicy government meetings, I know the adrenaline gets you through it, but it takes a toll. How are y'all doing?
No price is too high to pay for the placidity of the legislature being done, Alex. It was more than worth it.
I'm a little tired.
Fair. Well, we're almost a weekend.
Yeah.
I'll just note that we are live on OPB's YouTube page right now and on opb.org/livestream. So thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, smash whatever button you're supposed to smash. We appreciate it. And if you have any questions, we can try to get to them as we go along. But I'll start with some of my own first. Dirk, you've covered a few of these legislative sessions. Mm-hmm. How many, actually?
Seven? But only four. I think this was my fourth long session.
Okay. So there's often a rush to the finish line every year. But this one felt especially chaotic at the end. Fair to say?
It did, yeah. I mean, I have never had an experience where I walked into the last day of session and had literally no idea what was going to happen with the biggest bill of the session. And yet that is really what sort of befell us on Friday. We walked in, we knew that Democrats had this big transportation bill, $11.7 billion over 10 years. But we also knew it seemed to have some buy-in, but it was on shaky legs. It had just moved out of committee. Was it going to pass on the House floor? We learned pretty quickly, no, it was not going to. There were not the votes. And so Democrats on Friday morning were really scrambling to figure out, okay, if this thing doesn't move that we've worked for a year or more on, what can we do? And they were putting together a bill, rapid fire, to raise the gas tax by 3 cents, just sort of cobble together any amount of money for roads that might be useful. That is really what dominated that final day, this scramble.
Yeah, and in the middle of the scramble, Governor Tina Kotek showed up at the Capitol in an attempt to help legislative leaders get it all figured out as well. Yep. Bryce, you were also there Friday. What stood out for you?
Yeah, and just in comparison, this was my first legislative session as a reporter. So maybe my perspective is kind of skewed, but it felt like lawmakers were scrambling. I was sitting there waiting for votes on some of the bills that I was covering, and more than one lawmaker approached me and basically said, this just feels unusual that, there were lawmakers rushing back and forth from room to room. The House floor kept going on recess at times when most of the Republicans would leave all of it all at once. They were making deals for Democrats. They were sometimes making concessions around the transportation bill. But as we approached the end of the day on Friday, they seemed really, I don't know if unsteady is the right word, but there were legislative staffers who were walking around seeming frustrated or confused by the process. Like you said, the governor was out there in the hallway meeting with lawmakers and other leaders. Seemed that she was, trying to get lawmakers on board with this last minute sprint for this bill. The Republican leadership was basically standing right next to her as they were preparing to vote. It was just clearly this really politically tense moment.
Yeah, temperatures and anxieties running exceptionally high, I would say.
Yeah, and you guys just peanut gallery watching. So we last recorded a podcast last week on Thursday, a day before Sine Die, which for non-nerds is the name of the end of session. At that point, it was pretty clear the transportation bill had its work cut out for it already. But I'm not sure any of us expected it to implode the way it did. Dirk, what was the ultimate death blow to the hope of finding at least some money for roads this year?
Yeah, so we knew early Friday that the big bill wasn't going to be possible. This, raise gas taxes a bunch, raise all sorts of fees. We're going to charge EV users by the mile they drive, and really let's shift the paradigm of how we fund transportation here. That is how Democrats spoke of it. But this final death blow was more of a whimper than anything, I would say. The Dems were rushing all day to put together this Band-Aid bill, this 3-cent gas tax increase that was really designed at making sure ODOT wasn't going to have to lay off a bunch of workers. They put it in committee, they got it out of committee, but And the governor, as you said, was in the building. I think she said she had found enough votes. You need a 3/5 vote to pass a tax. She had found enough votes in both chambers to do it. What the Dems didn't have, though, was a 2/3 vote. And 2/3 was necessary on that last day because in order to put it up for a vote in the House chambers, they would need Republicans to agree to waive all the rules. Otherwise, under the Constitution, a bill needs to be read on 3 different days before it gets a vote. That can obviously, they didn't have the time. So it comes up for the House. The Dems moved to waive the rules to bring it to a vote. And I think, as everyone knew was going to happen, the Republicans said no. So bill's not moving. They were clearly going to adjourn, and the bill died.
So that was the moment that this all ended. But for people who haven't been following every turn of the screw here, how did this fall apart? How did it get to this point? Why at the very, very end of, months of session meeting, and who do you think deserves the blame?
Yeah, I mean, right. This was a year plus of work just to sort of just fizzle at the end. The question of blame is very, very interesting. And obviously with something like this, who you talk to is going to yield a different answer. The governor talked to reporters over the weekend. She was very engaged at the end, obviously, and was adamant that Republicans were the ones to blame because Democrats could have passed it if they would have just let them, do what they wanted. Sure, it was the last day of session, but you got to let the Democrats get their way. And she suggested that the Republicans were just lazy, and that's why they didn't want to do this. I think that we can talk about whether that makes a lot of sense. Top Democrats, they were more inclined to say, well, this is just a really hard thing we were trying to do. Past transportation packages have been sold on the backs of all sorts of projects all around the state, right? And that might not be something that's exceptionally hard to win votes for, right? You can tell X lawmaker who might have questions, hey, there's a bridge you want built in your district. Let's just write it into the bill. Can I count on your vote? That wasn't the case with this. This was really about shoring up ODOT, making sure the state has a bunch of money for maintenance and operations and basically the kinds of things that Oregonians probably expect as a matter of course for their transportation system. And so what Democrats said afterward was like, look, this is a hard thing we were trying to do. House Speaker Julie Fahey spoke with the reporters late on that Friday. Here's a bit of what she said.
Past sessions that have done transportation packages, the problem they're trying to solve is these big projects all around the state. It is much easier to get support for that kind of package than what the work that we were trying to do, which is to modernize the way we fund our roads and our bridges and our operations and maintenance.
So, basically what I just said. And they also noted transportation packages have failed in the past and come back a year or two later and passed. And maybe that's just the path that this is going to follow. Republicans, I would say, were a lot more unsparing. I mean, they were adamant that, they don't bear the blame for this. They say they were left out in the cold when negotiations got really important. And in fact, it's just Democratic leadership that utterly failed. Here is House Minority Leader Christine Drazen speaking with reporters a little before Fahey was just talking on Friday.
What we had was failed leadership this session. What we had was a lack of vision. What we had was a lack of clarity this session. And as we would reach across the aisle and we would say, there's plenty of money, let's redirect some of it, we were rebuffed, right? Like that wasn't their solution. Their solution was straight up new taxes at every turn. Okay, go do it yourself then.
and I would just say, for me, thinking about it, like, I can't get over the calendar, right? This thing had been worked on for so long, and yet we do not see a bill introduced until June 9th. That's less than 3 weeks before lawmakers absolutely had to adjourn. It didn't give Democrats the room to massage and operate and cajole and win votes and maybe make the changes that were going to be necessary. And then at the very end, if they leave themselves a week instead of a day, they would have been able to get over that procedural hurdle, and it wouldn't have mattered that Republicans weren't on board. So they just ultimately failed to give themselves the time at the end.
Do you have a sense as to why?
We could talk about that. No,
Yeah.
I mean, I think people would say, like, there was difficulties. This was a very complex thing. And so as they were working it up, it just took longer to get the legal language together, to get the revenue analyses together. But man, like, it's very hard for me to understand why they wouldn't do it a
Especially
little.
for being such a big figurehead
The,
bill.
the thing.
And I certainly think that Senator Mark Meek's decision to oppose the bill in its final weeks played a big role in throwing its chances too. I don't know if this is more on him or on leadership for, ultimately failing to keep, the party members on point, but he wasn't the only Democrat who appeared skeptical of passing at least the original version of the bill with all the new taxes and fees. When I spoke to Meek, he just thought that the bill was too expensive, too vast, that the new taxes were not responsible to pass given the high housing costs and high cost of living that Oregonians are dealing with. And he was just seemingly really outspoken in the final weeks about his decision, and that really I can only assume, must have rankled some of the leadership. And just to give you a sense of this, there was this moment in the final week where he stood up on the Senate floor. The whole Senate floor got really quiet and waited to listen to what he would have to say, and here's what he said.
From the correspondence I've received from around the state of Oregon and my community, both in letters, emails, phone calls, social media posts, I'm doing the right thing for Oregonians. Hope you can say the same.
Yeah. And basically what I heard a lot on Friday night was that, the revised bill, it just wasn't going anywhere because it didn't have that path through the Senate, right?
It truly was Mark Meek. I mean, all the Republicans were against it in the Senate. That meant all the Democrats had to be together. And when they lost Meek and he was not coming back to the table, he was the ultimate doorstop of this.
The poison pill there. Yeah. So we mentioned Kotek earlier. She's been pretty hands-off on transportation all session, which is why her last-minute involvement kind of felt sudden, at least from folks on the outside.
Yeah.
What was the governor's role in all this, and was it unexpected?
Yeah, no, pretty much everyone I talked to throughout the session, lobbyists, lawmakers, interest groups, said Kotek was not engaged on this. And I think the governor signaled very, very early on in session that was her intention. She introduced a budget that said, I would like to find $1.75 billion for ODOT in this next 2-year budget, but I don't have any thoughts about how we do that. Actually, lawmakers, please go out and find me $1.75 billion for ODOT in the budget. I mean, she has been, from the start of her administration, focused on education and behavioral health and housing. And I think she just continued in this session of making those her main focuses and sort of letting lawmakers have the fight and figure it out. I asked her about this. I said on Saturday, it looks like your party fumbled this. What were you doing to help? And why didn't you get involved earlier? And she argued that she was involved. Here is some of what she told me.
My team supported every conversation there was. When they needed information, we were there. When there was a problem, we were there. We were having conversations with legislative leadership all session long about how do we get this done? What do you need?
And she also said, they told me they had it. Every time I'd asked, they said they had it. Now, obviously, that wasn't the case, and Kotek did finally become very, very involved on that last day. I think the only time she testified on the transportation bill was when she was actually not testifying on the main bill, but trying to save this 3-cent gas tax increase. So very, very involved that last day, but not so much for the preceding 6 months.
But apparently she was behind the scenes.
Behind the scenes, she said. I think she said, I've been involved. I know you guys don't see that, but, I've been doing stuff. So.
Sure. So, as you mentioned, she also warned of massive layoffs at ODOT because this didn't pass. And in her press conference, hundreds of people. This has really rankled her and frustrated her. What else are you learning about the fallout from this failure, both practically and politically? Bryce, start with you.
Yeah, so there's the layoffs at ODOT, I think, are going to be the most immediate thing. That's going to be it's expected to be as many as 600 people this month, and that's a lot. I think the governor described it as one of the largest layoffs of its kind in the state's history. And again, just to recap, this matters because these are the staff that not only work on maintaining those roads and bridges, but they help fill potholes and plow snow off the roads. They respond to the scenes of crashes and storms and other emergencies. A lot of transportation officials around the state, including for county road departments, they're disappointed and they're frustrated that this bill failed. I talked to Chris Doty. He's the boss of Deschutes County's road department, and this is what he had to say.
It's just incredibly disappointing, that we're in this position again where, only this time there's meaningful cuts happening at the mother agency. We all need to have ODOT operating well to have a healthy transportation system.
But these problems, it really seems that these problems could extend beyond ODOT too, right? The city of Portland said this week that dozens of infrastructure jobs are at risk. Hundreds of streetlights might remain unrepaired. The city might have to delay projects that have already been funded. Counties are facing the same thing. I called several this week in rural and urban parts of the state, and they expect to put off certain infrastructure projects. And they say that they just expect that to increase costs. It could result in further cuts to staff as well.
I mean, you asked about politics too, and I think some of the dynamics here are very, very interesting because on the one hand, I think likely the voters of this state probably wouldn't be too happy with a major tax increase to see their titling fees and registration fees rising by a lot. I mean, maybe particularly if those things are just going to be paying for types of services that they already expect as a matter of course. That is a tricky place to be, and I think that's why we saw particularly some swing Democrats not getting involved. But there's a deeper level here, which is some of the legislative Democrats' main supporters were really, really counting on this bill. So SEIU Local 503 is the biggest union in the state, one of the largest supporters of Democrats politically. They represent a lot of operations and maintenance workers at ODOT. Then AFSCME, another huge union in the state, represents a lot of transportation workers in the city. What we saw on the last day of session was this fascinating dynamic where COTEC and the Democrats were putting up a 3-cent gas tax that was going to save ODOT. ODOT workers, right? SEIU loved it. It was going to completely cut out cities and counties that are also saying they may have to lay off. So AFSCME hated it, and we have two unions who are usually pretty allied, sort of fighting over table scraps at the end of as this thing's blowing up. Is there fallout there when it comes to election season? I don't know. I mean, I'm not predicting that, but just some really interesting sort of dynamics.
Something to be referenced in election season, I can
totally
imagine. So a lot of damage done or expected to be, the impact of this. We know still, though, that the governor has the power to call lawmakers back to a special session and say, hey, fix this. And she's already threatened it. Dirk, how likely is that?
Very unclear at this point. I mean, it is ultimately going to depend on whether top Democrats essentially can and will come together and decide whether they have a plan that they think can move, right? They would need to count the votes. They would need to ensure that Republicans will show up. They would need to basically ensure that they could get in and get out of a special session very, very quickly, because otherwise there's no reason a special session has to end. There's no constitutional limit. So often, Peter Courtney used to say special sessions are the most dangerous thing because you never know what's going to happen. They would need to have it really dialed in. But you are right. The governor, I think, got pretty fiery on Saturday when she was talking about this and asked what her plans were. Here's what she said.
What my plan is, I don't know what it is right now. Today's another day. Today's a new day. We're going to figure this out. And I need every lawmaker. I don't care how tired you are. I don't care what your vacation plans are. We are going to solve this. You're going to be spending a lot more time with me. We need to get this figured out.
Clearly, yeah.
Disappointed mom.
I mean, and a clear suggestion that she's very, very seriously thinking about the special session. Right. There's a lot of urgency here, right? ODOT says 600 people gone by the end of the month. That's not just people losing their jobs. Like, assuming we get more transportation money at some point, that creates all these inefficiencies where suddenly those people have to be hired back. Maybe they found other jobs. I was talking to someone on the Transportation Commission yesterday who said, and by the way, when we lay people off, we also have to pay out their vacation money. That actually increases costs. I mean, there is a huge amount of inefficiency and bother when you're sort of laying all these people off only to potentially bring them back if we find a solution. Right. It is not ideal. So I think that creates some further urgency here.
Well, before we move on to other topics from the session, how were the general vibes post sine die?
I mean, I said this the other day, like I've been to a lot of sessions. Typically on the last day with Democrats in the majority, you see them hammering home bill after bill after bill. Republicans tend to get pretty beat down, right? They're just like trying to get out of there. They're tired of it. They've lost a lot of fights. This was the opposite. Sitting around Republicans in the House, like they are ebullient. They're telling jokes. They're just having a great time. They saw this as a big win at the end of the session on the session's big sort of topic. And meanwhile, I wouldn't say Democrats were like crying. Some of them looked visibly not pleased, but everyone gets a little punch drunk at the end of session and everyone's a little happy, but certainly a different dynamic. I think Democrats were wincing as they walked out the door of those chambers.
Yeah. So highs and lows, but there were some wins. What bills stood out to you two that did pass? We talked about this, obviously this large one that failed, and I think that's the headline here, but there were some wins. Bryce, tell me kind of what stands out to you as the big ones.
Yeah. So one of the big ones that we've talked about on this podcast before was that the Democrats passed a pretty major gun bill. This was Senate Bill 243. We've talked about this before, but just to recap, it would ban, or it does ban, bump stocks. These are rapid-fire devices that can essentially turn a semi-automatic weapon into a fully automatic weapon, basically into a machine gun. Can't have those anymore in the state. The bill also gives local governments the authority to pass their own policies around concealed weapons in certain public buildings. It allows them to ban them from buildings. And so one of the other major ones, though, was that the lawmakers passed a pretty major wildfire funding bill. You might remember back in December, the governor called a special session of the legislature because Oregon hadn't paid a lot of its bills to contractors who helped out with fighting the wildfires that are growing bigger and bigger and costing more and more across the state each year. This session, they passed a bill that included a tax on nicotine products like Zyn, and also a plan to basically divert a portion of the interest generated by the state's rainy day fund. And this plan is projected to generate about $43 million toward wildfire prevention. Lawmakers say, that helps, but it's just not nearly as much as they need right now.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
Well, they wanted, they were hoping to be very ambitious on fire. I think that was seen as a half measure. And let's be careful. We could call these wins. I think that there's going to be a very divergent point of view onto whether these are wins particularly on guns. Yeah. Exactly. So, but some of the things that passed that I was watching, and I'll go quickly. I mean, they lowered the threshold for civil commitment. So forcing people who in severe mental illness to get hospital care. That is something that had been talked about for a long time. They passed a pretty enormous education budget, $11.4 billion for K through 12 schools. And then for the first time are going to require that school districts meet metrics to access that funding. And if they don't, there is going to be some further steps. So at a time, Oregon schools aren't performing great. That is some attempt to bring them into line. There's new strict restrictions on corporate ownership for medical clinics. We passed this book ban, this thing that makes it harder for folks to petition to get books out of libraries just because they don't maybe like that a character is gay or black or whatever some of the reasons people bring up. We further banned plastic bags. You won't see any plastic bags soon in your checkout at the grocery store. We changed Oregon's legal marriage age from 17 to 18, so minors can no longer get married. I mean, we did a bunch. Like, obviously, we're not going to be able to give it all the attention it might deserve, but that's just some that occurred to me.
We're in Portland right now. One thing some Portlanders are deeply passionate about is the possibility of bringing Major League Baseball to Portland. There was a bill this session that signaled a commitment to that plan. Bryce, what happened there?
Yeah, this was one of the most interesting bills that I got to cover this session. This was Senate Bill 110. And I should preface this by saying this does not mean that Portland is getting a Major League Baseball team in the immediate future. But basically, the bill aims to help Portland in its push to convince Major League Baseball, hey, we are ready for a team. It authorizes about $800 million in bonds to help fund the construction of a professional baseball stadium along Portland's south waterfront. My understanding is that basically taxes on player salaries and the salaries of the staff would help pay off those bonds over time. And again, like the MLB has not granted Portland a team, but
sweeten the deal.
Yeah, it sweetens the deal, and I think it got like very widespread support.
Yeah.
A lot of Republicans were on board with it, saying this maybe could revive Portland to what we hope that Portland will look like, and help it get out of this economic doom loop that they like to talk about. And Democrats, especially from Portland, were saying, hey, we need this too. This could be a real big help to the city and improve staffing and the economy here.
Yeah. So Democrats are in power in Salem, as we know, and they're famously close allies with unions. And you mentioned the kind of end of the transportation bill put unions against each other. But what did Dems do this year in other parts of the session to support unions and labor issues?
Yeah, I think maybe the second highest profile bill of session, or one of them anyway, was this bill, Senate Bill 916. I think we've talked about it on the podcast before, but what it does is says, for the first time in Oregon, workers, union members who are on strike can access unemployment benefits after a certain period of weeks. This was a hugely hard-fought bill because Oregon, in doing this, became the first state in the country that is actually going to allow public sector employees to do it. There's 3 other states to do this. None of them recognize the right of public sector workers to strike. So we now have the possibility that teachers going on strike will secure unemployment benefits, or municipal workers that go on strike will secure these benefits. And that created a lot of pushback from cities and from school districts who worried this policy was going to make it so strikes were longer. They would make it less likely that some deal could be come to because these workers would have more stability. And in the meantime, it was going to increase their costs potentially because they're paying out these benefits to workers as they go. At a time when budgets are really tight. Unions came back with an argument that was palatable to enough Democrats that this moved, which is right now they see the balance of power in union negotiations as tilted. They think that corporations most prominently are able to sort of wait folks out till their bank accounts get low enough, they're not being able to pay the bills, and they say, you know what, like I'll just take the deal you're offering with me because I need the pay. So I'm very eager to see how this shakes out in practice. There's a lot of doom prognostication that this is going to increase strikes by a lot. It's going to imperil the unemployment insurance trust fund. I mean, we just don't know. Like we're moving into uncharted territory, but that was a super interesting debate that I'll take with me from this session.
Yeah, and we'll have to see kind of when the next strike comes, what that looks like in practice, like you said.
Exactly.
Bryce, as we mentioned earlier, housing is a top priority for the governor and for a lot of lawmakers in the state. What did they do about this issue this year?
Yeah. So one of the big bills they passed was the budget bill for the state housing department. We've talked about this before, but this was a more than $2 billion budget bill. That's a lot of money, but it's still a more than $1 billion cut from the previous budget. Just to recap, lawmakers at this point have a lot less to spend than they thought they were going to have, about $500 million less in the budget. They attribute that largely to some of the trade tensions that we see and the slow growth in the state's economy. So they've had to make some cuts to various budgets. The biggest cut in this budget was to eviction prevention programs that provide rental assistance, legal aid to people who are facing eviction. And right now, there's more people facing eviction right now in Oregon than there have been for a really long time. Last year was a record high number. So a lot of people are concerned that without this assistance, more people will fall into homelessness. They also passed a number of bills aimed at building housing faster. And this is really important right now because housing production around the state is pretty stagnant. Local governments are actually issuing fewer housing permits each year for the last 2 years. And the total number last year was like the lowest in more than a decade. I think it was 12 years. And so for one thing, the lawmakers passed one of the governor's priority bills. This was a bill to build more dense housing or middle housing. They also passed another bill that cuts regulation in like the review for home design, planning, engineering. This was specifically for single family detached homes, middle housing developments inside the urban growth boundary. So yeah, this is pretty important because like Governor Kotek has always said that housing is, kind of one of her top priorities. But homelessness is still increasing. Thousands of Oregonians, like I said, a record number, are facing eviction each month. And I think whether these bills and this funding makes a meaningful difference will be a really big factor into like what defines the governor's political legacy in the long term.
Yeah, I will say too, governor has kind of stepped outside of the Capitol and come to Portland to specifically try to incentivize growth in Portland by partnering with Mayor Wilson on kind of getting rid of some fees for permitting process and stuff too. So it's something she's invested in very specifically in Portland, but also statewide as well.
Yeah.
As you just mentioned, the revenue forecast for the state was not as rosy as it's been in the past. How did that impact other priorities?
I mean, how it works is basically like when the pie shrinks, the number of possibilities that are going to move forward shrinks. So, it really did reduce the number of spending bills that were considered. Some of them top priorities like housing for the governor, or the governor also, I think, wanted $90 million for new residential treatment facilities for people in mental illness. I think she got 65, but it's just a ton of other bills. I don't even think we can quantify it. Like OPB has reported a lot on a bill that would have made it easier for people who were wrongly convicted and incarcerated to get payments from the state, right? For each year they were incarcerated. That bill didn't move, I think, partly because of cost concerns. It didn't move out of the budget committee. So there was a lot of things like that. But it wasn't just this revenue forecast that I think had a limiting factor. There is also a lot of worry right now about what the federal budget bill, they might be voting on it right now, this huge federal budget bill, what that's going to mean for the state's finances going forward. And so I think the budget writers were very cognizant about keeping money in reserve for trying to deal with that. So there's like $400 million plus in the ending fund balance. I think they gave like the emergency board, which can spend money when the legislature is not in session. I think they gave them $100 million just for whatever they want, and then $150 million for wildfires. I don't remember all the numbers, but they wanted to hold money back for contingency and figure out what's going forward. So that I think that was another factor here.
Let's talk about some other things that did not pass. Bryce, journalism had a moment, right? Tell us about that.
Right. So there was a bill that would have required big tech companies like Google and Meta to compensate Oregon newsrooms for the journalism on their platforms. The companies would have to pay a total of about $122 million a year, or reach other kinds of agreements. That bill died in the Senate. The senator who proposed that, Senator Confam from Portland, says that she plans to bring it back. There was another bill that would clarify when and how the Oregon National Guard can be deployed for service. That bill also failed in the Senate, and that's a big deal just given all of the recent news out of Los Angeles as well. There was also a bill that would rein in the thousands of bills that lawmakers propose every year that has kind of become this increasingly big problem because, lawmakers have to go through so many. It's hard to, for the public to look at all of them. That bill also died, which feels somewhat ironic in some ways. It would limit lawmakers to a certain number of bills that they can propose each year. I can't remember the total number. Yeah.
Interesting. Dirk, tell us a few other things that died. Rapid fire.
Yeah. Okay. We'll never do justice. They passed once again on a bill that would have somehow effectuated Oregon stopping the twice yearly time change. They talk about this every year. This time it didn't go very far. I think it passed the Senate. They did not pass a cell phone ban in schools, but just yesterday, Governor Kotek issued an executive order doing that. There was a proposal that would have changed how cities can use transient lodging taxes on when people come and stay in hotels. That would have helped cities pay for roads and other sort of general fund concerns from that money. That was fought pretty hard and it died at the end. I think a pretty interesting debate. Another interesting debate about recreational immunity, this notion that ski areas and other places are, because of a court decision, at increased legal liability when people get hurt there, and there was a bill that was going to maybe help them fend off lawsuits in that case. I think there's some really interesting fallout from that deserves some coverage, but that bill didn't pass. A bill to limit when the National Guard can be deployed didn't pass at the end because Republicans blocked it. Many bills, thousands of bills didn't pass. Just a couple that come to mind.
Okay, so we're reporters, we tell stories, and we like to make big sweeping conclusions around the things we cover, tie it up in a bow. These sessions are long with many highs and lows, and there's undoubtedly always a story or a narrative arc to follow and take away from it, what would you guys say the story of this session is?
I'll take a stab at it. I think one major takeaway is that even though the Democrats have that supermajority, that does not mean that they will be able to capitalize on it every single time. I think that a really big question moving forward is, how does leadership, whatever it looks like, plan to get the party on the same page, chart a course, and use that supermajority power in some kind of unified legislative effort for the next session. I think that'll be really interesting to see.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's something that we've talked about again and again on the session. I think starting when we did a halfway point of session podcast. This session, people use the word rudderless a lot. I mean, there just didn't seem to be a lot of clarity where the ship was heading ever. So in past sessions, we would see a lot of signposting from leadership. We are going to take this bill on, then we're going to take that priority on, then we're going to do this. Daniel Bonham, the Senate minority leader, said after session, Peter Courtney used to, in his office, I don't actually know if this is true, but this is what he said, would have 3 priorities and he'd say, if it's not serving these things, we can let it go. Like, there was a lot of vision and focus from leadership. And I'm not in many rooms in the Capitol, but I will just say from my perspective and from a lot of people I've talked to in the building, there did not seem to be that clarity of leadership, that real idea of where this was headed. It just felt like the hands were a bit off the wheel. And I don't think there's any better example of that than the transportation package, how it ended, how it didn't get released until the end. And Democrats just seemed to let the supermajority speak for itself and not, didn't seem to have the real tight control of it that maybe we've seen in the past and maybe they need. So I think, I think there did seem to be a bit of a gap in leadership this session. And I am interested, to Bryce's point, what it looks like moving forward. Are there consequences for that, or do the Dems sort of lick their wounds and say, we could do this better, let's try again later?
Right. It's kind of table setting for whatever the next chapter will be. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we'll leave it there for today. Thank you both for joining me for this delightful discussion, and congratulations on having the session behind you. Might be a special session, but
Thank
we'll
you,
see.
Alex. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for watching. This week's episode of OPB Politics Now was recorded live in the Gerp Royal studio. It was produced by Andrew Thien, and our audio engineer is Nalene Silva. Our music comes from Audio Network. In these uncertain times, we are certain that you have questions about local politics. Maybe we can answer them. We would love to hear from you. Email us at opbpoliticsnow@opb.org. We'll be back next week with more political news from across the Pacific Northwest. Until then, you can find all of OPB's reporting at opb.org. Thanks for your support, and thanks for listening.